everyone. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Rutgers Center for Transnational Law, we'd like to thank you for attending our webinar, Current Trends on Migration and Human Rights. We're very excited for this event and look forward to hear from our expert panelists. This time, we also like to encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at RutgersTTL. On behalf of the center, we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, which include the American Society of International Law, Latin American Interest Group, Rutgers-Newark Human Rights Working Group, and the Rutgers International Law and Human Rights Journal. Before we begin, I'd like to announce that during the last 20 minutes of this lecture, we will open up for questions and answers. So please feel free throughout the session to submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'll now hand it off to Professor Contesse, who is the director of Rutgers Center for Transnational Law.
Thank you, Corey. It's my greatest pleasure to kick off the Center for Transnational Law lecture series with a panel discussion on one of the most challenging topics of our time, the rights of migrants. Next week, the United Nations will commemorate its 75th anniversary. And as many note, the system that was set up 7 decades ago to prevent a third world war has effectively done so. Yet we witness new and pressing challenges all over the world, from climate change to transnational crime, from global pandemics to refugee crisis, to now recurrent attacks on against multilateral institutions. And so we've learned about some of these events in the past years, especially in the context of migration. And in a world that witnesses the surge of nationalism, it is our duty as both scholars and citizens to reflect on the ways in which we can move forward. To do so, we are honored to have Felipe Gonzalez, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, who will discuss the current trends and challenges on this specific topic. His presentation will be followed by comments by Rutgers Law Vice Dean Rose Cuison-Villazor and Professor Janice Gallagher from the Department of Political Science. And after that, we will have a brief time, 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. So as Corey just said, please use the function, the Q&A function, to pose your questions. Felipe Gonzalez is, as you know, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. He's a former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where he was also a commissioner and the rapporteur on migrants and refugees. He's a professor of international law at Diego Portales University in Santiago, Chile, where he also directs a master's in international human rights law, and he's an honorific professor at University Carlos III of Madrid. It is my greatest pleasure to hold the virtual floor to Felipe Gonzalez. Felipe, thank you.
Thank you, Jorge, and I thank the Rutgers Center for Transnational Law for this invitation. In fact, I was supposed to take the floor in reality, because this was an event that was planned a long time ago before the pandemic. But I guess it has some advantages to do it this way, because people can join from different places and not only in New York and in New Jersey. So I would like to provide a general picture about the situation on migration and human rights as I see it, and then I will very much welcome the comments by the commentators and the questions from the public. I have been in this position as a special rapporteur on the human rights of, and I think that the thematic reports that I have presented to the General Assembly of the UN and the Human Rights Council in Geneva reflect to some extent the main topics. These reports have been on the issues of returns and reintegration of migrants, access to justice for migrants, 2 reports on gender and migration, one on the international context and the international standards on gender and migration, providing a gender perspective on migration, and the other one on good practices on a gender perspective on the protection of the women migrants in different countries and the obstacles and challenges ahead. And the 2 ones that I have prepared this year were about the right of association of migrants, including right to belong and form trade unions, and the right of association of their defenders. And the next one, the upcoming one that is already in the website of the Special Rapporteurship, but I'm going to present it in October at the General Assembly about the detention, migratory detention of children, and alternatives to it, providing adequate reception for them. Through other means, through country visits before the pandemic, of course, and communications to states and different events, I have also addressed very much involved throughout the process of preparation and now the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration. So I expect to address to a larger or shorter extent these issues in my presentation. As a general point to start, I would like to stress that I think there is a feature nowadays in the international context that is different from before. Massive movements of people, of course, have taken place since humanity exists. But what makes difference the current situation is not the massivity, which has existed before, but the fact that these flows of migration are taking place simultaneously in all continents. Sometimes in the Western countries, we don't have a clear picture of this, but this is a situation that is going around the world, really. So you can see massive movements of people within Asia, within Africa, from some parts of Southeast Asia to the Middle East, from different parts of Asia to the South Pacific, and so forth. To the public perception, intercontinental flows of human mobility are larger than where there's more intercontinental other continents. The other point that is connected to this is the fact that the flows of human mobility have become more mixed than in the past. And by this, I mean that the clear-cut distinction that was that used to exist between migrants and refugees is no longer applicable. Now there is a blurred line between the situation of those who can be qualified as refugees and those who are migrants. And in fact, there are many people in the middle who may not be qualified to achieve refugee status, but who deserve other forms of international protection. This in addition to the fact that because of the serious obstacles of the proceedings to achieve the status of refugee in many countries, many people remain as migrants, and usually undocumented migrants, even though they would qualify as refugees according to international law. So the situation is also more complex in this regard than in the past. Over the last few years, we have seen some important changes that have produced a significant reform in the United Nations vis-a-vis the issue of migration. The United Nations has been addressing the issue of refugees for a long time, since its beginning, really. But in a significant manner, it hasn't really addressed the issue of migration until very recently. Of course, the UN adopted the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families in 1990. But so far, this convention has been ratified only by one of states, virtually all of them countries of origin of is at the time that those states ratified the convention. My own office was established in 1999, but and it has a universal jurisdiction. All special rapporteurs, thematic rapporteurs, we have a universal jurisdiction, but we are not really in charge of the governance of migration at the UN, but are monitoring the migration policies of the states and of the regional organizations to ensure that they abide by international law. It was very recently that the UN decided to go ahead with an instrument on migration of a general scope. This is the Global Compact on Migration that was adopted in late 2018, and which has been subscribed by 150-something states. That is more than 3/4 of the countries that belong to the United Nations. Although it's not a human rights instrument as such, it has a lot of elements regarding the protection of the human rights of migrants. It is quite clear, at least this is my assessment and of many specialists, that the massive influx of human mobility to Europe during the years 2015 and around 2015 was the decisive factor for the European Union to move ahead and join the countries of origin of migrants to prepare and adopt a global compact on migration. I'm going to refer to this at the end of my presentation. Now, in this context, one of the issues that we can normalization of borders. If I understand that most people watching this webinar are based in the United States, well, the case of the United States is precisely one like this, that it has an externalization of borders throughout an agreement with Mexico and the Central American countries. According to these agreements, people who are seeking asylum in the United States have to remain beyond its borders while the proceedings are accomplished. In one way or another, this is the same policy that the European Union applies through agreements with Turkey or with Morocco, for instance, depending on the countries. And in fact, also European Union has allocated many funds to countries like Niger in Central Africa, the southern border of the Sahara Desert, so as to try to impede migrants moving northwards throughout the Sahara Desert and then to the Gulf Mediterranean and to Europe. I was in an official visit in Niger and produced a report about this situation, which has strongly increased the level of security in the country, although these funds have not really contributed to the development of the country or to the fulfilling of the human rights of the Nigerians or the migrants who live or stay in Niger. In our cases, such as in Australia, this externalization is taking place through an agreement with Papua New Guinea, or using its own offshore islands as places to keep in hell the asylum seekers. So that's a feature that is very common nowadays. Along with this, I would say that a main feature is also the criminalization of migrants, which has expressions in different respects. The most heinous one is hate speech, xenophobic discourse against migrants, which unfortunately is going on in many countries around the world. I did an official visit last year to Hungary, where unfortunately this is a trend, and I made repeated calls to the government to avoid those statements that prejudice migrants in the country, and also people who may be considered to be migrants. For instance, for being of African origin, although they are actually Hungarians. And I would say that this is a typical feature, the combination of xenophobic discourse with racism. Racism is usually present in this xenophobic discourse, and it is not the same, the attitude toward migrants who are of the same race than most of the local population, than the approach toward the migrants or asylum seekers from other races. So this is an important feature nowadays that my mandate has repeatedly condemned. Now, criminalization might take different meanings, different ways. For instance, some countries establish as a criminal offense the irregular entering into a country. This was a typical feature, for instance, in Latin America for a long time, although since 10 years or so, it's not longer a crime. In the United States, this has been historically a feature, also the establishing of irregular migration as a crime, although it wasn't applied for a long time until very recently that the Attorney General gave instructions to prosecute those violations. However, the fact that there isn't a crime of irregular immigration doesn't mean that criminalization doesn't exist. For instance, there are countries, this is the case, for instance, in Europe or in almost all countries in Latin America, where, however, migratory detention persists. And we can see cases, for instance, in Mexico. In Mexico, irregular immigration is not a crime. It's not in the penal code, but massive detention based on migratory grounds is practiced. And this is the case in other countries around the world as well. According to international law, and this is also reflected in the Global Compact on Migration, detention based on migratory status of a person should be a measure of last resort. And immigration detention of children should be avoided at all times, either if they are accompanied or traveling by themselves. But this is a feature that, as you can see around the world and in the United States, is not applied in a number of countries. However, in this regard, in my upcoming report on detention of children based on their migratory status, I found out many practices around the world in many countries that do not practice immigration detention of children, but have instead adequate measures such as community managing or foster care for children or other measures, so as to avoid their detention and give them the adequate protection and care that they deserve. The other point that is relevant on the issue of criminalization is the situation of the defenders of the rights of migrants. We can see that this is a trend that is human rights defenders of migrants are receiving threats, and sometimes they are killed because of their jobs. This is an issue that I very much stress their importance in my recent report on the right of association of migrants and their defenders. Another issue which is of importance is the feminization of migration. Until a few years ago, the number of migrant males every year outnumbered by far the women migrants. This is not longer the case, and over the last few years, there are almost half and half, and some years more women migrants than male migrants. And this has produced many relevant changes in terms of the way the women migrants integrate in the societies of destination, the needs and the rights of women migrants, the specificities and the specific mechanism that should be taken into consideration by states to ensure that the rights of women migrants are fully protected, and so forth. So that's another point that is of interest and that we can discuss later. And there is another issue that is connected to women migrants, but of course it's not limited to them, which is the issue of access to economic and social rights. And in this regard, we can see that in many countries there are still differences between the migrant population and the local population, and sometimes and many times between the documented migrants and the undocumented migrants. In this regard, you can see that, for instance, in the issue which is quite acute these days, the issue of the right to health, while in some countries, migrants, in other countries, only urgent provision of health services is guaranteed for all of them. In some, I would say that during the pandemic, most of the states have been more flexible in this regard, but in any event, it's a very unstable situation, and this affects especially women migrants in the case, for instance, of sexual and reproductive rights. On the issue of the right of education also, according to international law, this should be provided not only to documented migrants, but also to undocumented ones. And the same on the issue of access to justice, which is a key mechanism to ensure the enjoyment of all human rights, including economic and social ones. In all these public services, there is an element that is a key one, which is the need to build strong firewalls between the public services and the migration or migratory agencies. And this is the issue that in the United States called the sanctuary cities, meaning that a hospital, for instance, is not going to share the information of the status of a migrant that is going to that hospital with the immigration agencies. So migrants will not be afraid of going to a hospital or sending children to the schools or going to the justice to denounce the crimes they are victims of, fear of being detained or eventually deported. In all these aspects, it's very important to establish a strong firewall as sanctuary cities do. And this is also a practice in many cities in Europe as well. However, at the national level, there isn't a single state which has established firewalls. These are only sanctuary cities, not sanctuary countries, to say it clear. There is also an increased movement of children, which has made more acute the need for adequate reception and care for them, and avoid at all times the practice of detention of children. Most countries around the world do not practice detention of children based on their migratory status. But there are some, like the United States or Mexico or some other countries, which do practice migratory detention of children in a large scale, which is very worrisome, of course. In this context, I would like to stress two aspects that are very significant. One of them is the issue of regularization, and the other one is the issue of multilateralism. I would like to stress the issue of regularization. According to the current development of international law, there is not a general obligation of states per se to conduct processes of regularization at all times. However, as many human rights bodies and also the Inter-American Commission at the Inter-American level have repeatedly stressed, there are some circumstances when process of regularization become really indispensable. This is the case, for instance, where there are massive massive groups of irregular migrants who do not have access to basic rights, or where there are some very exceptional and grave circumstances, like at the current pandemic. In fact, at the current pandemic, my mandate, along with the Committee on Migrant Workers at the UN and also the Inter-American Commission at the Organization of American States, have stressed the need to conduct these processes so as to ensure that migrants in an irregular situation won't remain in that status throughout the pandemic. I would say that regularization really is the key factor for the full protection of the human rights of migrants. It's not the only factor, but I would say that it's really a key one. In fact, it strongly contributes to the integration of migrants into the destination country, and also contributes significantly to avoid the association in the public imaginary, the association between migrants and delinquency. So that's why it's very important, regularization. And the other issue is the issue of multilateralism. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, until very recently, the United Nations didn't have really a multilateral approach. There wasn't a global institutional approach towards migration. There have been, of course, developments at the regional level, for instance, at the Mercosur in South America, or the ECOWAS in the Western African countries, or the European Union, or the Colombo countries of the Middle East and of Southeast Asia, and other processes as well, but not a global approach. And this is very important. I think the fact that this has been taking place over the last few years, which has the United Nations Network on Migration, and the adoption first of the UN, the New York Declaration of the UN on Migrants and Refugees, and later the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration. This is something unprecedented, really, at the global level, and I would say that per se should be a factor that will contribute to enhancing the migration policies. Of course, it's too early to see an impact of the Global Compact on Migration in the migration policies of most countries, but you can see that the machinery is moving. The machinery is moving. There are many states involved in the follow-up and implementation of the Global Compact in processes at which different United Nations agencies, such as the Organization of International Migration, UN Women, UNICEF, ILO, and other agencies are involved, and also the civil society. So these are projects at which, on many occasions, the civil society works along with the states. So that should contribute in the midterm to the enhancement of the policies on migration. The Global Compact on Migration itself, as I said, is not a human rights instrument. In fact, it combines different approaches to migration: the security approach, the development approach, the human rights approach, and other aspects as well. It has some references to a gender perspective on migration, although it doesn't explicitly address the issue of sexual and reproductive rights. But I would say that it's a good basis to work. And in fact, the United Nations human rights bodies, such as my mandate and our special rapporteurs, we are already working based on the Global Compact of Migration and relations when the alleged violator is a country which adopted the Global Compact on Migration. We invoke the Global Compact. So even if the Global Compact on Migration explicitly says that it's a non-legal binding document, regular practice on the part of the human rights bodies of the United Nations, the UN Network on Migration, and states themselves that become involved in this process. This recent development of multilateralism at the global level is an important step, whose results we expect to see as soon as possible. I would say that the pandemic, of course, has complicated things in this regard as well. Many states have adopted the migration policies more restrictive. Some of them which had avoided the migratory detention are practiced detention of migrants again, like in the case of Panama, for instance. But there have been cases of countries that have practiced massive detention based on the migratory status of the persons, who are not longer practicing them in the current of the pandemic. So I would say it's a mixed situation. Of course, migrants in many countries, in the context the severe restrictions of the pandemic, economic restrictions, I mean, they are going through very bad situations. In some countries, we have seen some xenophobic discourses and xenophobia practices by some parts of the local population in the context of the pandemic. And at the same time, we have seen experiences of solidarity towards migrants in different countries. So I would say it's a mixed situation that is taking place. I will stop here. I don't want to keep the floor for too long, and I look forward for the comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe, for that presentation. And I will give the floor now to Janice and then to Rose.
First, can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Felipe, for your important report on the current status of world migration. So as a political scientist, my questions are really about the climate of receptivity, which the UN High Commissioner on Refugees confronts. That is, how do you see the power and potential of your office to pressure states to comply with international law and norms around migration, and to effectively use the Global Compact on Migration to improve state behavior? So so kind of let me land those questions in some kind of particular questions. So I guess kind of big picture. So I should say first, I work primarily on human rights in Mexico, Central America, and Colombia. So that's kind of the context where I'm coming from. And for me, what I've seen in the past kind of 5 years is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, doing more with less. So they're faced with increased need, with growing violence, with growing abuse of human rights of their citizens as well as of migrants. I've seen kind of the UN agencies increasingly work hard to document those, work hand in hand with civil society. I mean, of course, they're interlocuting with government actors as well, but more and more they are one of the leading important actors who's doing a lot. And at the same time, I know that they're working with less. They're working with decreased funding, right? They're working in an environment where we have a rollback of human rights norms and a deterioration, as you just talked about, a deterioration of how the U.S. is treating migrants and how the U.S. is kind of the U.S. has all but abandoned even the facade of having a pro-human rights discourse. And so I think kind of with this funding crisis, with this legitimacy crisis, I wonder kind of what do you see in terms of the potential of your office to and the potential of the UN to shape behavior? Do you see kind of other actors coming in to complement? Do you see anything replacing work that the UN was able to do with comparatively, I guess, more resources? So I think kind of, to me, that's the context that I see. And to me, it feels like a crisis in terms of powerful actors capable of holding states accountable and really turning these non-binding agreements, turning kind of what in political science we call soft talk into real pressure. So that's kind of my fairly pessimistic but very honest kind of macro question about where we are. Next is I just kind of wanted to hear your a little bit different. I wanted to hear what you thought about how COVID is going to impact migrant rights. There were some connectivity issues. I didn't hear you talk about that. My apologies if you did. I'm just interested kind of in terms of, I know we're seeing a fall in migration in some ways. We're seeing states taxed in different ways than they usually are. I'm just kind of would love to hear your thoughts about that. And finally, you talked about the criminalization of specifically not just of migrants, but of migrant defenders. So it made me think about the migrant shelters that I've worked in and been in Mexico, and how key those actors are, not just in terms of serving migrants and advocating for their rights, but also in terms of information provision, right? So to even have an idea of who is coming, what are the rates of victimization, where are people coming from, kind of to have our finger on the pulse of what is happening in terms of migration. Those often non-state actors are really key. And I wonder, as they also are taxed as never before, and again, I'm thinking about especially so Mexico and coming from migration coming from largely from Central America and somewhat from Northern South America. How do you see them responding? Do you see, I mean, what I kind of see in a nascent way is those organizations really needing to meet, being kind of hungry for international partners and international attention. But again, they're trying to do more with less as states in some ways pull back. So those are some questions I'd love to hear you answer. Thank you for your work and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Janice. Let me remind people that the Q&A function is open and we are processing your questions. Rose.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you, Felipe, for being here and for including me in this discussion today. I really appreciated the global context of the various critical migration issues that are facing us today. As a U.S. immigration legal scholar, my comments and questions are framed along the domestic front. And I'm just curious to see whether you might be able to share a little bit more information to the extent that you can about some behind the scenes meetings or collaborations that that you and your staff and other allies with respect to speaking with US political leaders about our current immigration policies. So specifically, I wanted to raise at least two questions. First, you mentioned in your presentation the increased rise of racism in migration policies that you've seen in other countries. And certainly here in the United States, many of our political leaders have been criticized for overt racism against migrants based on religion. So in particular, there have been criticism of our political leaders engaging in anti-Muslim sentiments. There also have been comments against people from Mexico, from Central America, from people from Haiti, and other African countries. So in the courts, unfortunately, many of these explicit racism, and by courts, I mean here in the US, in our federal courts, these explicit racist comments have not been successful in challenging some of the policies that have been enacted on the federal level. So I'm wondering to what extent your office has been involved in speaking with any of our political leaders or leaders who represent the United States at the UN level, and how to better address racism that is currently that is quite evident coming from our political leaders. Related to that is the second question I have about more broad immigration policies that have been passed by the Trump administration. You mentioned the Remain in Mexico program that has been challenged in federal courts and have been stymied by the federal courts, but there have been other sorts of immigration bans. And we know that the last executive order passed against people who are coming from primarily Muslim majority countries have been upheld by the US Supreme Court. Since this year alone, there have been a number of different immigration restrictions against certain people from China, people who are coming from countries that have high COVID rates. There have also been other immigration bans or rather policies that have impacted asylum seekers and refugee applicants. So I'm wondering, to the extent that you can, if you could share a little bit more about some of the strategies and collaborations that you or your office has been engaged in trying to address these types of US-based policies. And I'm specifically curious about if there are any other countries that have different, more welcoming policies, unlike the United States currently. Whether you see some possibilities of collaboration and as a way of pushing the United States to reverse its actions in essentially closing our borders to many migrants coming in to the United States. So those are just my initial quick questions and comments. And I once again thank you for being here with us and for giving us your time and for your report.
Thank you very much, Rose, for those comments. And let me just throw a couple of questions that are in the Q&A, Felipe, and you can address all of them, and then we will be processing more questions. A couple of people ask about climate change and thinking in terms of environmentally driven changes in migration patterns. Could you address that particular situation? Another person asked about, in the context of the recent US withdrawal from the United Nations Human Rights Council, whether COVID-19 has added significant current geopolitical obstacles to human rights advocacy and defense within the UN and in the UN in connection with other organizations. And finally, we have a question from Nepal, Southeast Asia, asking about if there are any specific international mechanisms through which returnee migrants or migrants in the process of returning can claim their rights. So those are a few of the questions that we're getting and added to the comments and questions posed by both Janice and Rose.
Well, thank you for the comments and the questions. Very much appreciate them, that cover a wide scope, a wide range of issues. The first regarding Janice, the first question was regarding the receptiveness of my mandate, and she added of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights Office. I would like to explain to the audience that we special rapporteurs do not depend on the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. We serve ad honorem as independent experts, but the High Commissioner Office on Human Rights provide us with staff. So I would say that the roles of the High Commissioner on Human Rights Office and the special rapporteurs is complementary. And it is the office, it is the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the one which has offices around the world, not in all countries, but in many countries. We special rapporteurs do not have much staff, nor we have offices in different countries. So there is a feedback in this regard. And I think it would be difficult for me to evaluate the impact of the UN High Commissioner Office for Human Rights. But I think that it makes a difference. I started working on international law before the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights existed. It was created in the mid-90s, and it really made a difference. I think it's very important to have a permanent, large mechanism as that. And in the case of the special rapporteurs and independent experts, we necessarily have to focus on some countries more than in ours, depending on the gravity of the issues, and on some topics more than others. But we try to cover as much as possible. I would really, in the case of the question regarding the impact of my mandate, I would really say that it depends on the countries. It varies very much from country to country. In some countries I have seen policies changed as a result of initiatives undertaken by my office along with other actors. Other countries are not receptive at all. Some countries do not accept my requests for invitations to conduct official visits. So I think it really depends on the country, the level of impact. We have to be patient in this regard and keep insisting. And I would connect this with the statement by Janice in terms that she mentions that we are going through a crisis, a migration crisis. And in fact, I think that the situation of human rights of migrants in many countries around the world is worse today than it was 10 years ago. But I think that this context has also prompted to some good initiatives, as the initiation of multilateralism on migration at the United Nations, the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration. And this reminds me, to some extent, the situation that occurred in Latin America during the dictatorships. That in that very terrible context, a strong human rights movement came forward, and I think that was a key factor for the development of democracies in a region like Latin America, which didn't have a significant tradition of democracy. We can see on the issue of migration that, in fact, the civil society has enormously expanded its work. When I started, for instance, when I started at the Inter-American Commission as Rapporteur on Migrants and Refugees in 2008, I would say that the countries which had a significant number of NGOs working on migrants' rights were Canada, the United States, Mexico, and Argentina, and that was it. Nowadays, it's completely different, and almost all countries in Latin America has a significant number of NGOs working on migration issues, and the academia is much more involved on migration. So it has become a matter where different actors can also influence. And so I think that if I agree that this is a crisis, but it's a crisis from which we should try to get some positive results at some point. Janice also was mentioning the issues of COVID and human rights. I addressed this matter to some extent in my presentation. And I would like to stress in particular a joint guidance note that my office and the Committee on Migrant Workers issued last May in this regard, stressing aspects like the need for regularization processes, the need to release most of the migrants who are in detention, and all children who are in detention based on the migratory status, the need to guarantee access to justice and to economic and social rights for migrants throughout the pandemic, and also to establish these firewalls for sanctuary cities, as I was mentioning. And overall, that the exceptional measures that countries may adopt in the current of the pandemic should be subject to judicial control. This is a matter at which we had very bad experiences in the past in Latin America, because in the old times, and not only during the dictatorships, but also in democratic regimes, whenever a government enacted a state of emergency, that meant that it virtually there was no control by the judiciary on their measures. This is not the context. So right now, I would say that in democratic regimes, you are seeing in different countries that the judiciary is controlling the executive in some countries to a significant extent. Regarding the defenders, I think that Janice made a point that is very important, because in addition to the issue of the role of the defenders to protect the rights of represent the migrants and protect their rights, there is the issue of monitoring and providing information to the general public. And I think this is a matter of concern at the current pandemic. I have discussed this in meetings with NGOs from different regions around the world, and there is this same concern that the NGOs are have severely been prevented from having access to adequate information about the impact of the current policies on migrants, let alone to be able to visit the centers of detention of migrants to oversee the conditions there. And of course, independent monitoring is a key factor for the protection of the human rights of all persons, including in this case, the rights of the migrants. Concerning the questions presented by Rose, well, When I started as a rapporteur in August 2017, so the current Trump administration was already in place. What I have done repeatedly since then has been to send communications and urgent actions to the federal government in regard to different policies and measures. This has included the massive practice of migratory detention, the Remain in Mexico policy, the lack of an adequate policy of regularization, the issue of racism as it affects migrants, and a diversity of policies that discriminate against migrants. Since at the beginning, for the 10 first months or so, the US government responded to my communications in a general manner, and then the US retired from the UN Human Rights Council in June 2018, and then it stopped altogether from responding not only my communications, but communications from all special rapporteurs. It was about 1 year later, in mid-2019, that the US government started to respond against to the communications I have sent. I haven't seen much receptivity, to be frank. I think that there was an extreme situation that at which the government changed its policy, which was that extreme situation when migrant children were kept in cages. And as you know, there was a very strong international reaction in this regard. And then there was a change of the policy. I have also repeatedly asked for an official visit to the United States. I have not received a no for response, but I haven't received a response, actually. And in fact, the only official visit by a special rapporteur that has taken place during the current administration was the one by the special rapporteur on extreme poverty that had been accepted by the Obama administration. Since then, there have not been official visits. The problem is that if a thematic rapporteur or a thematic mechanism more generally is not granted an official visit, one cannot produce a country report. That is a serious limitation, a limitation that, for instance, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights doesn't have. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights can produce reports on countries that do not allow the Commission to make visits. We cannot do that. Only country rapporteurs can produce country reports in the absence of a visit. But the United States, there isn't a special rapporteur, a country special rapporteur for the United States. And the thematic rapporteurs have not been granted visits, so that's limitation. Rose was asking me if what could I talk about the meetings not being without committing any discretion. Well, I don't have anything to say actually, because I have not been able to address substantive issues with the US authorities. My meetings have repeatedly been about a potential visit. And I responded later, but I haven't received a response so far. The issue of racism and migration in the United States, also any of the communications and the press releases that I have issued regarding the United States. I would say that racism is connected to xenophobia in many countries, but in the case of the United States, this is especially especially acute, especially acute. In regard of the other questions, the questions presented by the public on the issue of climate change and migration, well, this of course is an issue of major concern. My predecessor issued a report about climate change and migration in 2012. That seems like the Middle Ages at this point, considering the very worrisome evolution of climate change. So I am evaluating the possibility of producing a new report on climate change and migration for the year 2022, that is 10 years after the first thematic report on this matter. I have received information from different regions around the world on how climate change is impacting massive flows of human mobility. As you know, there is also this emerging concept of climate refugee, or otherwise there might be persons who may qualify for other forms of international protection when they are escaping from serious consequences of climate change. So it's an issue that I definitely have in my radar for the near future. About the question of the relationship between COVID-19 and the US vis-a-vis the UN relationship, well, I'm not in the position to evaluate the relationship between the US and the UN as a whole, based on the COVID context. But on the context of the human rights of migrants, I can definitely say that the COVID in the United States has led to increasing violations of the human rights of migrants. In terms that the right to seek asylum has become virtually inexistent during the last few months. The conditions of detentions have become much more a matter for concern due to the infection of by COVID-19 by migrants. There have been limitations in the possibility of for the civil society organizations to monitor the situation and to have access to information. So all the situation that I described more generally about the COVID-19 and the human rights of migrants, in the case of the United States, are more acute. So it's a matter of utmost concern. And finally, the question presented about Nepal. Well, Nepal was a country that I visited, an official visit 2 years ago. And the issue of the return and reintegration of Nepalese was one of the key aspects of the report. Nepalese can bring their complaints to my office or to the Committee on Migrant Workers. Although my office doesn't have a case system as such, but so it doesn't lead to a jurisprudence, but it reacts to requests from the civil society, sending communications to states. I'm conducting follow-up on the situation that are being denounced. And the same for the Committee on Migrant Workers, which can also address the situation in different countries in the regular and the periodic exams of the situation of the rights of migrants in those countries. If the situation has other, of course, it can be submitted to other special rapporteurs as well, like the rapporteur on racism or other rapporteurs that might be competent to the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. We have a couple of questions and 8 minutes before we wrap up. So I'm going to read one question. Someone from Sweden is asking about your thoughts on how countries may weaken their protections for migrants. She mentions the specific example, the specific case of Sweden and a new strict migration law, which offers only temporary residency that came into force in 2016, which is, however, applicable retroactively to anyone who applied for asylum after November 2015. The question is, can a country offer lesser rule of law protections to migrants than its own citizens? And a final question, which will allow me to make a comment for you to finish your remarks. Tim Raphael, who's a center affiliate as well, says that he was in Marrakesh in 2018 and was struck by the overall pessimistic perspective on the impact of the Global Compact. And at the same time, the Mayor's Migration Council were meeting in Marrakesh as well. He says that there was more enthusiasm with the mayors, and so wonders if and how mayors and cities may be working towards creating more humane and just policies and practices that affect migrants, and so be in a better position than the countries at the national level and even the international community. So from a geopolitical perspective, whether cities and local governments may be better equipped to give answers to the needs of migrants. And here's my final thought for you, Felipe, if you can reflect on taking a few steps back from where we are now that we are commemorating 75 years of the United Nations. It seems to me that with all the current crisis and the attacks on multilateral institutions, a new consensus may be needed to really protect from an international and local perspective the rights of not just migrants, refugees, and people in general. So what are your thoughts as we commemorate 75 years of the United Nations, and many people tend to agree that the institution is going through significant challenges? How do we move forward, especially when we think of immigration as one of the most pressing challenges that we are currently witnessing?
Well, thank you for the questions to the audience and to Jorge. Regarding the question about Sweden and thinking about this matter more generally, the pandemic, some countries like Italy or Portugal have granted temporary residence to undocumented migrants, which is an important step in the current context. So they may have access, full access to health services in time. Other countries have not even do that. And residence, temporary, complete solution. And I think that the person presenting the question is right in that regard, because it leaves people in a sort of limbo about their future, their possibility of integrating into the country of destination, the extent to which they can do plans, if their rights might be curtailed in the future, or if they may be deported at some point. So that leaves the persons in a situation of instability. That's why we are calling, I mean, the human rights bodies at the United Nations, we are calling repeatedly to conduct serious regularization processes to ensure that migrants are fully documented and not only on a temporary basis. Regarding the situation of the Global Compact, well, I myself had mixed feelings throughout the preparation of the Global Compact. The preparation of the Global Compact had three stages. The first stage was a stage of consultations. States, UN agencies, civil society, academia, the private sector, the national human rights institutions, and other actors. The second one was a stock taking that took place in December 2017. And the third stage was the stage of negotiations of the text of the compact. Throughout the consultation process and the stock taking, I became increasingly concerned about what the outcome of the compact would be. And I think that in the end, what it came as a text of the Global Compact on Migration in 2018 was better than I expected in 2017. And I think that the leading role played by Mexico and Switzerland in this regard as the facilitator was a key factor, as it was the role played by the civil society throughout the process. Because the civil society, in fact, although it couldn't negotiate, properly speaking, it was present at the discussion of the Global Compact on Migration throughout all the stages. As I said before in my presentation, the Global Compact on Migration has different components. I would have had a number of many provisions, really, and I would have much liked the structure of a human rights instrument, which establishes a list of rights and the limitations to some of them. The Global Compact is not like that, but it wasn't expected to be doing that. And I think that both the countries of origin and a number of countries of destination and the civil society and the academia made a lot of contributions to ensure that the protection of the human rights of migrants is present there. Explicit reference to the core human rights treaties. It mentions them explicitly, and this is very important for the interpretation of the Global Compact on Migration. And that is something that my office is already doing, applying a relationship, a systematic analysis between the Global Compact on Migration and the international treaties and on human rights and the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Regarding the mayors and the Global Compact, I think definitely the answer is yes. And in fact, there is a coalition of mayors from cities around the world that is participating in one of the Global Compact on Migration in terms of selecting projects to be funded in different countries and regions of the world for the implementation of the Global Compact. I think that the mayors, the cities are able, I put the example of the firewalls, but in many respects, access to public, provision of public services and of other successful than the countries as a whole. And finally, regarding the question about new consensus. Well, I would say that the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees constitute a new consensus. it may not be entirely satisfactory. It is not entirely satisfactory for me, but I think there are no consensus. A consensus that was reached on the basis of the different interests involved. So while the countries of origin at both compacts were much more stressful in terms of protecting the human rights of migrants, the countries of destination were interested in seeking a legitimation of the returning policies, for instance. So I think there was a trade-off, and that is the new consensus. Not entirely satisfactory for me, but I think that is better than not to have a consensus at all, as it was the case until the year 2015 or so. And now there is a whole institutional framework in place in the United Nations regarding the issue of migration that didn't exist before. Of course, this is not going to change the situation from the night to the day, but in the mid and long term, this should help to enhance the situation of migrants around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. And thank you everyone for joining us today with our first event, the lecture series of the Center for Transnational Law. It's been great to have you all. Please stay connected. Stay tuned for future events. You can follow us on Twitter. Our website will be live very, very soon, and we will keep the conversation going on. Thank you all.